Good evening, friends. And so today I welcome all of you for our 12th webinar. And today we are going to talk about the Afghanistan peace process. So finally, after 19 years of global war on terror, once again we are negotiating in Afghanistan with Taliban and trying to churn out a future, a peaceful Afghanistan in the future. So today we're going to talk about the different aspects of this ongoing peace process, how it is going to churn out. Are we going to have a peaceful Afghanistan, or is it going to be another jihadi hotspot in the future? These different aspects will be discussed by our eminent speakers today. And today we are joined by the eminent panel, includes Ambassador Amar Sinha, who has been currently the envoy to the peace negotiations in Afghanistan, and who is also the member of National Security Advisory Board, and who was the Indian envoy to Afghanistan. Professor Madhav Nalpat, who is the editorial director with Sunday Guardian and NewsX, and Dr. Michael Rubin, who is currently the resident scholar with American Enterprise Institute. So I will begin with Ambassador Amar Sinha, sir. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. Just one correction. I don't think as an envoy for the peace talk.
Okay.
Yes, we were sent to Moscow, but that was a one-off event. I found your the sort of the title of the seminar very interesting. The healing the wounds of Kandahar and Kabul. Of course, Kabul, we know that it continues to bleed, but we'll come to that later. But Kandahar has very interesting connotations. I don't know if the audience here would know that Kandahar was where the Afghanistan as a state was sort of imagined and set up in 1747, Ahmad Shah Durrani. But the importance of Kabul, within 20 years, his son actually moved the capital to Kabul, and it has remained there since. But for Taliban, of course, Kandahar is important because it was the seat, not only it's disputed whether Mullah Omar was born in Kandahar or the neighboring district of Uruzgan because there are two villages of the same name. But the fact is that even during when the emirate was in power in Kabul, Mullah Omar never moved out of Kandahar. And that is where perhaps he also fled from there after 2001 when the American troops had landed along with the Northern Alliance people. He, of course, fled to the neighboring country along with some of his very honored guests who, of course, fled separately, but eventually to be found in Pakistan in 2011 in Abbottabad, the Osama bin Laden I'm referring to. Of course, from India, it has painful memories of Kandahar, IC-814, we all are very familiar, and which has actually left a certain mindset in the public opinion in India, which is very anti-Taliban. Beyond other reasons, IC-814 is something I think every Indian will remember, and the role of Taliban in that thing. But that we'll discuss in question and answer. I'm sure people will have questions about that. But when we look at from Kabul's perspective, after 20 years, as you said, this global war on terror, the February 29 agreement, I think, has brought Afghanistan closest to a possible peace sort of negotiations. Attempts have been made for the last 10 years, actually, attempts have been made. 2008, I think it started in Germany, or 2009. But it has not led anywhere. First time it was in this US initiative, which happened, it was sustained over 18 months, and eventually it led to an agreement between the US and the Taliban. Now, of course, people say that this is some sort of a peace agreement, which I don't think it is. Even if you look at that agreement, it says it's an agreement to bring peace to Afghanistan, signed between US and the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, which the US does not recognize. This is the way it has been described in the agreement, not once, but 17 times. But anyway, that is besides the point. But the fact is, this was the first time when it created a framework and certain set of conditions which needed to be met before the intra-Afghan or the Afghan peace talks could begin. And that is how we have started this intra-Afghan talks had started on 12th of September after most of the conditions that Taliban had set were met, which included substantial number of prisoners which were released, over 6,000. Then, of course, some substantial troop reduction on the US side. It was to be brought down to 8,500 within 135 days, if I don't mistake my that agreement. And, of course, further commitments of troop reduction. In return, the Taliban had offered assurances that it will cut links with Al Qaeda, and of course, it will engage with Afghan sides, and eventually they will work out a framework, and then they will have a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. And that is, I think, where the problem began, because the ceasefire and the end of violence was perhaps not put up front. It became the deliverable for a peace talk, which has really no timeline in sight. So it took 6 months to just kickstart it. It has gone on now for over 2 months, with nearly 3 weeks of hiatus, where all sorts of pressures have been brought on both sides so that they move ahead. But they're still stuck on very procedural issues, but substantive issues, because Taliban is insisting on a certain Islamic theology, or what they call the Hanafi fiqh, on which the future Afghan system would be based, which unfortunately is not acceptable to the Republicans because of the Hazaras, who are Shias. And so that is where we really are stuck. But of course, parallelly, there are demands, and you can see demands for interim government to be formed and how to move forward, whether Taliban should be given further legitimacy by making them part of the Afghan delegation going to Geneva for peace talks. So there are a lot of cross currents. Of course, the first part was the easier part, because there the interests of the US and the Taliban coincided. The US wanted US troops reduced. President Trump wanted US troops reduced, so that happened very quickly. But that's where we are really stuck. Now, of course, you hear voices from the US that the further reduction of troops would be condition-based. It has come from senior levels of the military, etc. But also we have seen President Trump saying that 25th of by Christmas, he'll bring the boys back home. So there is again confusion. So my own understanding is that since Taliban has got, now it knows that it has a hold and an influence on Afghan politics and Trump campaign, I think it's going to wait her out till 3rd of November. I don't see something dramatic happening in the 3 days. So they will see what is the outcome. And if Trump too comes back, they will wait and see whether he meets the promises that were made to them. If Biden comes in, of course, then I think there'll be a longer hiatus. They will have to wait to see whether the US would uphold this agreement before they actually engage or even think of reducing violence. Unfortunately, this agreement has an inbuilt tolerance for violence against Afghans, because there was absolutely zero commitment or demanded from Taliban that they cut down violence against Afghans. What they had promised was they would cut down violence against American troops and the NATO forces, which by and large they have respected. But you have actually seen a surge against the Afghan civilians, and the losses are very high. And of course, that poses the danger that this talk can derail any moment. Any high-profile attack, like, for example, the attempted assassination attempt on Amrullah Saleh, the vice president. Had it been successful, I don't think there would have been any peace talks happening at all today. Similar, such dramatic incident can derail it. Of course, meantime, what Taliban is doing is that it is using all sorts of excuses to increase its sort of hold on different cities. You have seen attacks in Helmand. You have seen attacks all around the country, including against targets which were really off even Taliban's code of conduct. They should not have been attacking school children, maternity hospitals. But they now are arguing, well, we are in Helmand, for example. They argued, no, we have not violated the agreement. We are only taking back the territories which were taken from us by Afghan forces. So I see that what they are doing, that first they had justified their fighting for 20 years on the basis of presence of foreign troops. When that condition was met, they have sort of pushed the goalposts further. Now they say that the Afghan government and the bureaucracy serving it are all proxies of foreigners. So it is haram, so that justifies their jihad. Then they say that while our prisoners have been released, the fact that they, of course, overlook the fact that they have gone back to fighting, but the fact that Afghan forces are confronting them on battlefield and attacking them is a violation of the agreement. So that justifies their continuance of jihad. So on and so forth. On the political side, of course, Taliban has said that we want emirate, not from Doha, but other leaders have said. But what they have said definitely is that Mullah now Akhundzada will be the leader of Afghanistan. So this is, of course, presupposing the outcome that they would want whatever form of government, but it has to be Taliban on top. Now, is that acceptable to Afghan people? I don't think so. There was a recent survey done by NGO. It's a Heart of Asia. It's a newly formed NGO by some prominent people, and they went through the rural districts. They went to all the areas including those areas which are controlled by Taliban. And I think the results are absolutely eye-opening because the support for Taliban, while of course there's great willingness on Afghanistan to have peace and for Taliban to be reconciled, but the support for an emirate, unfortunately, does not exceed even 10%, even areas controlled by Taliban. And I think that is something that is a clear message to the international community, which, to my mind, once the Americans had started engaging with Taliban, I think every country started hedging their bets, and they thought that Taliban were coming in power tomorrow. And there was really a mad rush to the gate to engage Taliban, which actually provided them a certain amount of legitimacy and hardened their position when it came to actually negotiations. So what really happened in terms of perception, that instead of Taliban trying to reconcile with the Afghan government, it now appears as if it is the Afghan government and Afghan people who have to go and reconcile with the old Emirates who have a government in exile sitting in Doha. And that is how they are behaving right now. So obviously there are concerns. There are countries now which are thinking that perhaps they have gone too far in mollycoddling Taliban. There's a need to pull back and need to correct the narrative and perhaps impose certain more conditionalities on Taliban that what they say they will adhere to. Now, the biggest commitment that they gave to Americans was cutting their links with Al Qaeda and other terror groups. Now, there itself, if you look at the record, only 2 days ago, actually, the UN coordinator, I think it's called Fitton Brown, he went on record to say that we have noticed that even while Taliban was negotiating with the US government and giving them assurance of cutting links with Al Qaeda, actually very high level contacts they maintained between Al Qaeda and Taliban. And they were assuring Al Qaeda that just sit tight, our historical relationship will not change. Now, these historical relationships, unfortunately, over the last years have perhaps deepened through marriages, through greater sort of dependability, fact that Al Qaeda now actually owes allegiance to Amirul Mominin of Taliban. So all that is complicated, and there is absolutely no proof that they have any intention of going through with their promises. Even the U.S. ambassador who looks after counterterrorism, I think, I forget his name, Ambassador Adam someone, when he was asked that, what do you feel, have they started, do you see any move in that direction? He said, well, we hope or we expect Taliban to honor its commitment. So they're still in future, and that we will keep monitoring how they go. So obviously, I think the US side is also not very sure. The only encouraging sign I saw was, of course, I think Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad is in Doha right now, trying to talk sense to Taliban, that they need to show flexibility. How successful he would be, I'm not sure. But he did tweet that the window of opportunity will not be kept open permanently. So, of course, many in India have said that this was not a peace agreement for Taliban, for Afghanistan, which was a US withdrawal agreement, an agreement to facilitate sort of a managed and a peaceful and a systematic withdrawal of the US troops. But that is something I think need not be discussed here today. Uh, on See, two drawbacks in this entire agreement was they overlooked the two very important aspects. That what is it, or from where did Taliban draw all the strength that they could engage the international forces for over 20 years? Obviously, they had certain support bases, they had sanctuaries. This agreement, unfortunately, while of course it enjoins Taliban to cut links with terror groups, it actually does not do anything to cut links to its own support bases, which are outside Afghanistan. Until that happens, I think they will remain a potent force. They may not be able to defeat Afghan government. In fact, even when Emirate was there, 1996 to 2001, I don't think there was peace in Afghanistan. They were challenged by different groups. And I think that will happen. So Taliban also knows that they will not have military victory. So obviously they want that somehow through international pressure, by change of narrative, that they are a very nationalist force and they don't have global ambitions. They be brought into the power structure, and then they manage to get to total control. Now that is a frightful situation as far as if for people who are looking for peace in Afghanistan, because that is absolute guarantee for complete disaster and perhaps going back to a civil war situation. And has been made clear by, I think, most Afghan leaders. Most Afghans want a republican system to continue. They also want Taliban to come back, but they don't want Taliban leaders to come back with their ideology. Uh, and now you can see that there's Mr. Hekmatyar, perhaps, who's also part of the original bandwagon of anti-government forces, who came back as a reconciled leader, is now actually singing a different tune. He now is talking about interim government. He also wanted to have a separate side deal with Taliban. He mentioned that. So I see that it's a well orchestrated sort of um, orchestra, and one knows where the conductor is and why it is happening. And you should remember that Taliban really and Hikmatyar are part of the original Hizb Islami, which is one of the Mujahideen factors which was created to fight the Russians. It was the Khalis faction uh, which broke away in 1939, where both Jalaluddin Haqqani and Mullah Omar belonged, and that is what has eventually turned into Taliban. Of course, Haqqani network then was brought into Taliban mainstream, so that they are very much embedded there. So that is where we are. I am not pessimistic, but I'm not sort of overly optimistic that this is going to lead to any peace. Uh, in fact, some of the former Taliban leaders, in fact, one of them is, I don't know if you all have heard about Rahmatullah Andar, and this government, Afghan government, took a very bold decision. He is an ex-Taliban commander who has just been made 1 month ago the spokesperson of the National Security Council in Afghanistan. And he says that if you think the Taliban will cut links with terror groups, I think that there is a surprise waiting for you in store. So he himself is, of course, not very hopeful. Uh, the other interactions that we have had, you would have seen a stream of leaders come to India in the last 3 months. And I think that was the time we had all argued that, no, we really don't have to get very anxious in the first stage of negotiations, which was really bilateral US Taliban negotiations. But once the intra-Afghan dialogue begins, I think India needs to sort of scale up its game and get engaged with all the nationalist leaders and factions, and which in the last 20 years, I think we have built very good equity with leaders cutting across the spectrum and geography. So I think government is doing that. So we will have to keep basically the Republican and the nationalist forces together while they meet with Taliban. One of the myths, of course, is that this intra-Afghan negotiations, when people say that, just put all the factions of Afghans together, and that is why this nomenclature itself is wrong. It is actually Afghan peace process where the role of external actors is equally important. So to minimize it to that you put the two warring factions of Afghans together and there'll be peace, I don't think that's going to happen. we will have to, and there'll be a lot of international diplomacy and heavy lifting required so that everybody gets onto the same page, at least in terms of what they want as an end state in Afghanistan. And some of the critical neighbors are Iran, Pakistan. They will have to come out to vocally in support of a system that we have. We haven't seen that happening yet. We know Iran at the end will not want a Taliban-controlled government in Kabul, but we are not sure of Pakistan. So let me stop here, and I'll be very happy to take questions later. I give the floor to Mr. Rubin and Mr. Nalapat, who are absolutely experts on the region. I have had the pleasure of listening to them before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. You beautifully covered all the diverse aspects of the peace process. I'll come back to you with some very relevant questions regarding India's stakes. Recently we just heard about the raid which Afghan National Security Forces conducted on a Taliban camp, and the 10 Jaish people died in that camp. So we have really major concerns about what's going to happen in Kashmir, and also the India's position of Afghan-led and Afghan-owned negotiation. So, and the extraterritorial actors which are actually controlling the things there. I'll come back to you with those questions. But before that, I would like to invite Dr. Rubin, especially on so Dr. Rubin, it's the same Taliban which in 1999 gave shelter to the people, the terrorists who hijacked IC-814. Then it also gave shelter to Osama bin Laden. We all know that, no? And after 19 years of fighting against these people, I mean, which kind of represent a barbaric forces, a very primitive ideology, what goes into the minds of the American Strategic Committee to negotiate a peace deal, I mean, which doesn't even look like a peace deal? Secondly, how are we going to marry the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan? What's going to happen to the Afghan National Security Forces, which has about the strength of 3 lakh personnel, and the Taliban, which has 1,50,000 regular and irregular troops? And lastly, if you guys leave Afghanistan, after that you have China, you have Pakistan, just waiting to grab the space in Afghanistan. So how do you look at it? I mean, and the condition of minorities and females. Okay? So please, Dr. Rubin. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for having me, and I want to thank the Usanis Foundation, of course. There's an old Soviet joke which talks about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The pessimist is the Russian who says, things have never been so bad. War, violence, hunger, they couldn't possibly get worse. And the Soviet optimist was the one who said, no, they can always get worse. So let me define myself right now in that context as an optimist. Things can always get worse. When it comes to the U.S. diplomatic process, too often, of course, Americans are inward looking, we're navel gazing, and we tend to consider diplomacy against the backdrop of our own political calendar. If you look at the history of American diplomacy with so-called rogue regimes, and for this I use the definition that was put forward by the Clinton-era National Security Advisor Tony Lake in a 1994 Foreign Affairs article, what we find is that when the United States engages in peace processes, whether it's with the Islamic Republic of Iran, whether it's with regard to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, North Korea, or in this case, the Islamic Emirate, the Taliban, what we find is that for many diplomats, American diplomats that is, we stop seeing the forest through the trees, and the process ultimately becomes more important than the peace. Our goal becomes trying to ensure that the process continues, and we lose the end goal of what the point of that initial process was. There's also the context here that after, of course, 19 years, the Americans are exhausted with war, and I mean, we're in a dire financial straits and so forth. And so people will say, we have absolutely no choice but to engage in diplomacy. But there's also a logical fallacy here, because just because plan A and plan B doesn't work, doesn't mean that plan C does. And if we look again at the history of American diplomacy with groups like the Taliban, we are always in trouble when we don't have a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. when those with whom we are negotiating recognize that we have committed ourselves only to that negotiation and that we're not willing to walk away from the table. The other issue that's important to recognize is, of course, ever since the Iraq War, the issue of politicization of intelligence has become a hot button political topic within the United States. But again, if we look at the history of the politicization of intelligence, what we find is far more often intelligence is politicized, is cherry-picked in pursuit of diplomacy rather than in pursuit of war. We are willing to engage in logical somersaults in order to have any excuse to keep diplomacy alive, and therefore, at least on a political level, we're willing to discount the repeated warnings that the Taliban are not sincere. Again, I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past. And my critics would say I only get that right about 50% of the time. I certainly don't have a crystal ball. But when we look at Afghanistan, history, of course, is important, and there really isn't a precedent for this sort of negotiated settlement bringing peace. If we look at, for example, the initial Taliban assault on Kabul back in 1996, a lot of people forget that came during a ceasefire and against the backdrop of a UN brokered negotiation process in order to have a broader government, indeed, much like today. The Taliban were willing to negotiate until such a time presented in which they could achieve through military force what they couldn't achieve at the negotiation table, or what they couldn't easily achieve at the negotiation table. And one of the questions I've constantly asked American officials is, given that we have engaged, as you said in your introduction, with the Taliban before, during the Clinton administration between 1995 and the year 2000, we had more than 30 high-level meetings, ambassador or above meetings, including ministerial rank meetings, when, for example, in 1997, then U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Bill Richardson, went to Kabul and proudly said on CNN that he had come to an agreement with the Taliban to end the civil war in Afghanistan. Of course, that didn't work that well. What we see is that the Americans will constantly engage in this process, ignore all contrary intelligence, and honestly put wishful thinking above reality. I certainly agree with Ambassador Sinha when it comes to this notion of cutting links with Al-Qaeda. Whenever I talk to administration officials on this, and they bring this up, I look at it not as cutting links with Al-Qaeda, but cutting links with brothers, fathers, and cousins. And in the Afghan social compact, is that realistic? I'm not trying to make an excuse, but we have to deal with the reality of this. If you're demanding they cut links with Al-Qaeda, and of course the intelligence shows that they have not, we have to recognize the unlikelihood of certain promises being kept. Now, what worries me most as we look towards the future is a couple issues. When Najibullah, when the Soviet Union fell and the Soviet troops withdrew, Najibullah managed to hang on for another 3 years. And when we look at the reason why, it's because in the United States, we talk about our peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. But for the Russians, there was also, if you will, a peace dividend as they were able to bring home troops and stop funding bases in East Germany, the Czech Republic, and Poland. Now, much of that equipment and some of that money ended up going into Kabul to fund Najibullah. But in 1992, when that money dried up, when Najibullah wasn't able to provide patronage, that's when his administration collapsed. It would be absolutely ridiculous and complete wishful thinking for any American diplomat to suggest that the United States is going to remain committed to Afghanistan financially, no matter what diplomats decide. Simply put, it is not Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad's place. It's not the State Department's place. The only people who can make this commitment is Congress, and the mood in Congress is sour. if we just want to look at the American political context, if Afghanistan becomes a disaster after the Americans pull out, from a partisan perspective, the Democrats, who are likely to win the majority in Congress, can simply blame this on the Republican predecessors and wash their hands of it. It's using Afghanistan as a political football. It's not fair, but if I can be blunt, it's the American thing to do. Now, we also have a problem in that sometimes American diplomats can feel themselves too clever by half. And if we're thousands of miles distant or thousands of kilometers distant from Afghanistan, or if we're simply shielded from the reality of Afghanistan by blast walls and intelligence analysts who never get outside of the compounds in which they sit, we may actually believe that it's a sophisticated solution to utilize the Taliban to fight against the Islamic State. That too is going to turn into a huge mistake, especially when, again, the difference sometimes between the Taliban and the Islamic State is the difference between brother and brother, cousin and cousin, and so forth. Nor is it correct to look with a very dramatic structure at the orders of battle and the hierarchies of various terrorist groups, when perhaps their leadership remains constant. But as Osama bin Laden said, everyone likes to attach themselves to the strong horse. And so at a local level, you can have people shifting from one group to another and have absolutely no hesitation to do that. I agree with the ambassador on this whole problem. The Taliban has really never offered to compromise on the whole issue of the emirate versus the republic. This is a huge issue that can't be wished away. Likewise, when it comes to foreign fighters, look, I appreciate the Taliban rhetoric that all foreign fighters need to leave. I wish that American diplomats were a little bit more skilled at standing up and saying, okay, give us a timetable for when the Pakistanis, when the Chechens, and when others who are fighting with the Taliban are going to go home. If we're going to talk about the foreign fighter issue seriously, we need to talk about the foreign fighters as being not only the coalition support of the Islamic Republic on one side, but also all those foreign terrorist groups and foreign nationals who are fighting with the Taliban on the other side. Of course, I haven't mentioned Pakistan. And this also is a problem that can't go away. I lament that the United States hasn't, before entering into negotiations with the Taliban, implemented a number of tools which we could have, nonviolent tools, to raise the cost to Pakistan of terror sponsorship. For example, removing the designation of NATO, major non-NATO ally, putting much more diplomatic pressure to bear on FATF blacklisting so we don't have the travesty that we've had over the past week with a continued gray list and so forth. Cracking down on the fact that 80% of the explosives used by the Taliban come from two specific fertilizer plants in Pakistan that we are no longer actively monitoring. One thing, when it goes to the broader question of whether peace can be achieved, let's just not look at this compartmentalized into Pakistan. Prior to, right now in the American mindset, and of course, in America, when I used to teach in the university, my ice-breaking question for my students would be, what's your earliest political memory? And without a doubt, it wouldn't be ancient history was 10 years ago. But of my students, none of them would hesitate about coming to the university from more than 2,000 kilometers away. Now, in the region, of course, ancient history or near history is hundreds of years ago, and people don't want to move thousands of kilometers away. They want to remain very local. If we want to look at the broader sweep of history, we Americans might look at the problem of infiltration as going from Pakistan into Afghanistan. But of course, in the 50s, the 60s, and so forth, early 70s perhaps, the infiltration was going the other way. And when I've talked to senior Afghan officials, some of whom hold very senior posts right now, they've told me after, for example, the Indian embassy in Kabul was bombed, that the Americans don't know heck about counterterrorism, and that if you want counterterror, if you want to have effective counterterrorism, then the way to do it is when a bomb goes off in Kabul, then a bomb needs to go off in Islamabad. When a bomb goes off in Kandahar, then a bomb needs to go off in Lahore. Now, I'm reporting a conversation. I'm not advocating for this. But if the American presence isn't there, there are elements within the Afghan government which probably will likely try to take their fight into Pakistan as well to assert a cost on Pakistan, which they lament hasn't been imposed as of yet. And so this, of course, will make the problem even more acute. Just in conclusion, I would say, and of course I say this as an analyst rather than an advocate, the United States is very much prepared to leave a mess on both India and Russia's hands. And we haven't been able to get, while Zalmay Khalilzad will argue that the Taliban have fundamentally changed and become more nationalist from the last period of negotiation in the late 1990s, aside from taking the word of specific diplomats, we haven't seen any evidence to convince us that that's true. So again, I conclude my short remarks as that Russian optimist. Things can always get worse.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. Thank you. I'll come back to you later with the questions pertaining to the rise of ISKP and the emergence of other, I would say, Afghanistan becoming a global jihadist hotspot. But before that, I would like to invite Professor Madhav Nalpat, to share his thoughts. Nalpat sir, you have written extensively on Afghanistan. In fact, at one point of time, you even wrote that India should help Afghanistan in defeating Taliban. Okay. So now, I mean, this whole thing after 18 years of investment in reconstruction, development, I mean, I would say globally, I mean, we are negotiating with Taliban, especially Americans are negotiating with Taliban. So how do you look at it, where it is all going to lead ultimately? I mean, do you see it as a peace process or a major disaster in the future? Can you hear me, Dr. Nalapa?
I think he's muted.
Okay. Sir, you'd have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Am I okay now? Am I audible now?
Yeah. Yes, you're audible. Yeah.
I want to say that I completely concur with Michael Rubin, completely. And frankly, I am a little surprised at completely concurring with any scholar from the United States. It hasn't happened for quite a long time, but it's his insight, if I may say so. He doesn't just look back at history, he's looking into the future as well. And of course, history does get repeated more than once. So possibly that's a help to him. I also agree with Ambassador Sinha. I just want to expand the scope of this discussion a little beyond Afghanistan, because let's not look at issues in a very narrow prism, and just look at issues in the broad. And if you look at that, for example, and you go back a little in time, for example, George W. Bush coming as the president, the focus was on China. There was some incident involving a US aircraft and a surveillance aircraft and some Chinese aircraft, and but the focus was in China. And all of a sudden you had 9/11, and immediately the focus shifted to Afghanistan, and of course to all the different strands that went into 9/11. Of course, as Michael Rubin correctly said, the Pakistan strand was insufficiently studied. I mean, we have all talked about the Saudi role, but the reality, the Saudi role was essentially providing money, a lot of the brain power, a lot of the planning, a lot of the selection of personnel. I'm not saying for the people who actually carried it out, but certainly facilitators, for those who encouraged them, was in Pakistan, and some of them were in uniform, or were in uniform, or still, or were once in uniform. So I'd like to say that from the Chinese point of view, it was really, if I may say so, a godsend that you had 9/11 and you had this kind of a complete interest in that part of the world. After that, of course, George W. Bush went into Iraq, and the various things were done there. I mean, I think I'm not going to bore you with a lot of what I've written, but all I can say is that for the Chinese it was a godsend, and if I may say so, and I would definitely not say in any way that in any way some kind of a ridiculous conspiracy theory that what is happening in Afghanistan or what is happening in France or what is happening in parts of Europe has anything to do with China. It has a lot to do with France itself. And for example, the French getting involved in Libya, the French getting involved in Syria. And if you check back at what I've written, I've said, for example, in the 2011, the Arab Spring is going to be a Wahhabi winter. And Libya, you remove Gaddafi, and you're going to have a flood of people washing up in Europe. The same thing with Syria. I mean, I don't hold a brief for Bashar Assad. I think, the words which I'm not going to use in a public forum, but the reality is the so-called freedom fighters who were armed, trained, equipped, and of course funded by different clusters of countries remind me of the so-called freedom fighters who went into Afghanistan and may then come to Afghanistan, which is essentially the mistake that was made was basically outsourcing this to Pakistan army, and they outsource it to the radical elements among the Pashtun population. Now, the reality is that whether you're Hindu or you're Christian or you're Jewish or you're Muslim, there is a proportion. You have roughly the same proportion of radicals and extremists and the same overwhelming majority of moderates, irrespective of the faith that you belong to. But for a long time, we have tended to look into the Muslim world with a kind of a magnifying glass in which basically sees only the radical elements, and we conflate that with the entirety or the overwhelming majority of the Muslim world in a way that we do not when confronted with with radicals of different communities. We certainly don't mistake those radicals as representing entire communities. Now, Wahhabism has got a long and checkered history. I mean, the British found it very helpful against the Turks. The Americans found it very helpful against Arab nationalists. The Americans again found it very helpful against the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan. But 9/11 and even today, if I may say so, judging by the flirtation that's going on between the United States and Turkey, Donald Trump has also got certain weaknesses towards Wahhabism, which I did not really once think that he had, given the fact that he has given strong support to Mohammed bin Salman, in my view, correctly, despite some of the some of the news reports about him. And the reason is that he's the first member of his family to de-link from Wahhabism, and if I may say so, this de-linking from radicalism, Wahhabism, Khomeinism, is absolutely essential to the good health of the Muslim community and to the global community, of which the Muslim community forms an important part. Signaling is important. And this is unfortunately something that we, in a world where we look at substantive outcomes, we look at material outcomes, we look at resources and kinetic situations, we forget the importance of signaling. And quite frankly, the signaling, for example, which President Trump did regarding just throwing the Kurds under the Erdogan bus, when Erdogan has come as, in fact, second to none in trying to lead Wahhabis globally. The Turks were fighting Wahhabism for a long time, and Wahhabism was used to eliminate them from much of the Arab world. And now, under Erdogan, Wahhabism seems to have triumphed. But you have the situation of Donald Trump, pushing the Kurds under the Trump. And some of us who have been talking about an India-US alliance for quite some time, and even we got a certain amount of a little bit of a doubt. How can you trust a country that is putting under the bus some of its greatest fighters? I mean, the George H.W. Bush did it. George W. Bush did it. And now you have, Donald Trump doing it. So that signaling has been very, very unfortunate for the United States, just as the 2008 signaling was very unfortunate for, if I may say so, the Western world. And as a consequence, if you go to the Middle East, after 2008, non-Westerners, including a large number of Indians, have been basically put into much more leading positions in that part of the world than was the case pre-2008, when the Arabs lost an enormous amount of money for absolutely no fault of their own. The signaling of this particular agreement with the Taliban has been a pretty bad blow to this effort within the Muslim community itself to ensure that Wahhabism gets rolled back. You've seen what has happened, in France, and I've seen, for example, some justifications that look, MF Hussein, look at MF Hussein. Well, I'd like to point out, MF Hussein left the country with his head intact. He left the country with his fortune intact, and all his family and assets are also intact. I think there's a slight difference between that and what happened to that French teacher and what has happened in that French church. A considerable difference. They can't be conflated together. But there is a narrative about India. Many people in the Democratic Party have bought that narrative. And I'd like to say that I'm a person who believes anybody who kills another person for eating a particular kind of meat is a terrorist and should be dealt with as such. But I'd only like to say that some of these things have not been helpful, because today you have this global war on Wahhabism. And guess what power will be, in fact, quite delighted if the Wahhabis continue to be strong and continue to spread in the committee of humanity in the world. There is one country who would very much like the focus of attention, the main problem, if I may say so, to be that kind of a problem rather than themselves. You and I know very well. I am in a university where you have an awful lot of doctors, but the reality is that I know next to nothing about medical science. But I am told that if you're talking of different kinds of pain, if you have a greater pain, then you feel that pain, and the lesser pain goes less. So I think in case the pain of radicalism to the Western world, to democracies like India, increases in scale, there will be an expectation that exactly what happened with 9/11 will happen again. And instead of being seen as a threat or even as a rival, they will have to be seen and co-opted as a partner. I'm again would like to say there is absolutely no question that there would be no conspiracy whatsoever. It's just that an alignment, kind of a coincidental alignment of interest. Having said that, let me spend a little bit more time. I'm sorry for taking so much of time. A little bit more time in Afghanistan. Anyone who reads my writings, anyone will know or that I have been negative about this particular deal with the Taliban because of the simple reason that Afghanistan was once a very moderate country, and the Pashtuns have a proud history of being an extremely moderate people. You had Buddhism in Afghanistan. You had Hinduism in Afghanistan. And you have temples, you had Buddhist viharas in Afghanistan. You had the Bamiyan Buddhas, for example. That didn't come there by accident. You had all these trends, and the Pashtun people took care of them beautifully until, unfortunately, they were, in a sense, the Wahhabis were sent to quote unquote rescue them, and they were pushed into this dark night from which they have not emerged ever. So the reality of the situation is that selection of Pakistan ensured that extremists and fanatics were chosen over Pashtun nationalists. And the reason was quite simple. If you're a Pashtun nationalist, well, many of you may not believe in the Durand Line. You're not going to do anything about it. You may believe it is a historical injustice, but if you're a religious extremist, the Durand Line or any such geographical line dividing countries becomes irrelevant. It's a totally different kind of topography that is there in your mind space. So I would like to say that so far the Taliban is concerned, its linkages with Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's linkages with ISIS, all these things are never going to go away. And of course, one of the important reasons that has been pointed out is kinship. The other important reason is, of course, the reality that from Ziaul Haq's time, the Pakistan army has openly cultivated these kind of auxiliaries, and it has no problem with this kind of mindset among its own soldiers. And Pakistan has escaped very lightly. In fact, it has been rewarded for bad behavior repeatedly. Most, for example, by George W. Bush, that tireless fighter against terrorism, who basically he and Cheney went went along with the arsonist to fight the fire. That is, Pakistan was made the enemy when in that time Atal Bihari Vajpayee extended the hand of friendship. Jaswant Singh, Atal Bihari Vajpayee extended the hand of friendship to the United States, and I think it was a cardinal error that basically that hand was refused, and again they went back to Pakistan out of maybe vestigial memories of Pakistan, the memories from the period of Reagan, memories from the period of Carter, Brzezinski, whatever. But as Michael Rubin, I'm sure, will confirm, it's very dangerous if you follow the track of the past into the future. I mean, if you follow the track of Europe in the 1930s into the future, I think you're going to have a much higher cost inflicted on the democracies than if you don't follow that particular track that Europe took in the 1930s when dealing with certain threats that were not recognized as threats for a very long time. I'm only saying this whole thing has been a mistake, and this whole thing is going to cost the United States a lot. And as far as India is concerned, I repeat what I say, we cannot be secure unless, if I may say so, other regions are also secure. This cannot happen alone. It has got to happen along with the United States. And that is why I have been pushing for this Indo-Pacific partnership of India and the United States. I'm glad that Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump have signed 3 of the 4 foundation agreements. The first one actually was, basically the military agreement, which was signed under Vajpayee. The Congress government signed none of that. Mr. Modi has signed 3 of them. And I think on the American side, I think the Trump administration has been pretty, if I may say so, forward-looking in ensuring that India comes on board. Obama, for about 4 years, he was in the grip of the Clintons, and the Clintons are what made the Taliban. In fact, the fairy godmother of Taliban, her influence, Robin Raphael, is still floating all over Washington, and she's still basically parroting what the Pakistan army wants her to, wants to be said. She's been parroting this for a long time, and there are people listening to that. But all I'd like to say is, very frankly, that this entire move, this agreement, was a big mistake. And it's a mistake because if India, and I would request, Ambassador Sinha to carry this to his friends in the government, because that our role is the same role as it was in Afghanistan in the past, helping the Afghan government against this extremist force that, if I may say so, some opportunistic or befuddled minds in Washington and elsewhere are trying to foist. If you bring the Taliban into the Afghan government, you are going to have a cancer at the heart of the government. And more importantly, you are going to do a disservice to the people of Afghanistan. I again repeat, Afghans are overwhelmingly moderate. They have seen Taliban rule. They will never accept Taliban rule. And even if the government of Michael Rubin, the government ably represented by Ambassador Sinha, various other governments do not help them, they will fight the Taliban. So if I may say so, we are going to see significant pain in Afghanistan because of the work done by Zalmay Khalilzad. He's following in the footsteps of Robin Raphael, and I'm sorry to say Donald Trump is following the footsteps of Bill Clinton. This entire agreement is a disaster. I am so happy that we're talking about the word healing, but for the word healing to take place, first you have to eliminate the virus, you have to eliminate the disease, you have to eliminate the cancer, and I can tell you it cannot be done by embracing the disease and by spreading the virus. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nalapat. Thank you very much. So now I'll begin with the question and answer session. My first question is to you, Professor Nalapat. In the beginning, you mentioned that 9/11 was a great godsend for the Chinese. So now, when Americans are leaving Afghanistan, is it going to be another godsend for the Chinese, with their Pakistani friends and another friends in Iran, and Erdogan also trying to flex muscles in Afghanistan? So is it going to be like that? We have a question also related to the same issue. It's by Mr. Siddharth Ganju. He's asking that is China's role in Afghanistan and global jihadi ecosystem being underplayed? Would you like to take this question?
Well, I'd again like to say that I'm not alleging any kind of conspiracy at all, but I would only like to say that China is very friendly with the Pakistan army. In fact, China is not friendly with Pakistan. China is the ally of China is the Pakistan army, and not the people of Pakistan. For me, I am for the people of Pakistan, which is why I am against the Pakistan army. China is very friendly with Turkey. China is very friendly with Iran. And if I may say so, Ayatollah Khamenei is keeping alive communism, which in my view, I have hyphenated way back, more than 15 years ago, Wahhabism and communism. There may be some perceptual and conceptual differences, but their overall objectives, their mindsets are very, very similar. So it could be that China is friendly with all of them. China is empowering all of them. And if China is seeking to prevent Pakistan from exporting terror into India, preventing Iran from Mr. Ayatollah Khomeini from trying to do what he has been doing in some parts of the world, if China is trying to prevent Mr. Erdogan from doing what he has been doing, I have not heard of it. Again, I would like to say, I don't believe that there is a kind of a strategy in this. All I can say is the Chinese have been very helpful to the Wahhabis in a situation in which more and more people in the United States have begun to smell the coffee and moved away with them, moved away from them.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Sinha, I have a question for you. You discussed about the various aspects of the peace process, but I want to specifically focus on the Indian stakes in that. Okay? As I mentioned earlier, in one of the raids of Afghan National Security Forces on Taliban, 10 Jaish commanders were killed. Okay? So, I mean, there are strong apprehensions. Many of them openly expressed by Indian agencies in the past that once Americans leave, there's a possibility that Taliban may help their Deobandi fellow brothers, Jaish-e-Mohammed in Kashmir. And secondly, even the ISKP, which we generally say that it has nothing to do with Taliban or Taliban is controlling, is trying to counter ISKP. ISKP's commander Aslam Farooqi was caught. He was found to be in links with Lashkar-e-Taiba. So what do you have to say about, India's security concerns vis-a-vis the emerging scenario in Afghanistan? Ambassador Sinha.
Thank you. I guess in your question itself, the seeds of the answer are there. You see, to start trying to study every group independently, especially in the context of AFPAC region, and especially the terror groups which have been spawned by Pakistan, I think is a fatal mistake. You see, Taliban, etc., these are like administrative commands of the military. Depending on what theater you are acting in, you are given different names, your mountain division, your plains division, your Kandahar division. You have to start thinking afresh that what is it that these are cheap options for Pakistani military or the deep state, that they have created different groups. Don't be mistaken by the different brands. That is more because of administrative purposes, I think they have done. Ideologically, it is absolutely the same. Why Jaish-e-Mohammed? I'm not surprised at all, because the fact that Taliban operations in Afghanistan, at least against India, have all been outsourced through different agencies. Depending on who has troops on the ground, whether it is the Haqqanis or Jaish, it is planned somewhere, executed by somebody. So these are all subcontracting. And what Mr. Rubin said, that you have to think about brothers and difference between cousins and brothers. In fact, I would go a step further. At times, you don't even have to differentiate that. The only difference is what time of the day it is and what flag you are carrying. And that has been proven many times in the differences between, say, you can be Afghan flag bearer in the morning and by night you become an Islamic State. So these are all labels of conveniences. A lot of research has been done. And Pakistani role has been actually researched. Mr. Malapat said it has not been studied. Actually, it has been studied by American scholars, very well documented. What has happened because of the exigencies of the circumstances it has not been talked about by the American diplomacy, etc. Different reasons. No, Pakistan was a very useful partner for Americans in 71 when they opened up to China, then 79 to 89 when they were the conduits for fighting communism in Pakistan when all these jihadi elements were created. Then, of course, since 2001, Americans have depended substantially, in my mind, very wrongly, but they did depend on Pakistan for the war that they were fighting. Unfortunately, now they are depending on Pakistan even for the peace they are seeking. So there is an element of dependence which has created this sort of a position which has, of course, both diluted American positions and made it more difficult. Ultimately, I'm sure American analysts are smart enough to analyze that Taliban draws its strength not because it is great fighters and they have engaged Americans and the NATO forces on their own steam, but that is because they have had terrific support. Unfortunately, that sort of the steps, or in fact, the actions beyond Afghanistan could have been taken were not taken. This would I don't think the war would have lasted 20 years if one really looked at the genesis of the war and where the sources were, and that is a reality. And of course, I'd want to downplay that aspect because, coming from an Indian diplomat, it looks as if we are provoking Americans to take action against Pakistan. But I think I got encouraged by what Mr. Pompeo said yesterday while in Delhi. He did point out that what are the challenges that both India and US are facing together, both on land and in maritime. So, but that is a reality, and you have to one day speak about it openly, and only then you will find a solution. You see, you look at Lashkar-e-Taiba, in fact, that it became a potent force actually in Afghanistan when it was founded. We remember, of course, IC 814, etc., and how these guys were taken in. But Pakistanis then created two potent forces from all these people. There's a direct link between what happened in 2001 and the guys who, I think Omar Saeed, who was released from Indian prison in IC 814, was it Omar Saeed or one of the characters who was later traced that $50,000 he had transferred to the attackers of 2001 in US. So, when Clintons and others, in fact, Hillary Clinton, while they were blamed for it, but she was the one who had also, I think, said that Pakistan is growing snakes in its backyard. And the fact that it is recognized as terror central, it is not for nothing. For different reasons, it has not been articulated that well. Even today, I think there is a certain optimism in US that they can perhaps use their influence to bring back Pakistan from the path it has chosen. But we, looking from India, feel that that point is gone. I think Pakistan is too far into the Chinese camp. It is a gun for hire. And now it has been hired by China. And I don't think there's coming back. So they will not become a dependable partner for Americans, how hard they try. Have I answered your question? But for us, the concerns of the future government, I don't think Taliban, if you look at Taliban statements, of course, they have given reassuring statements to India. That first, Kashmir is not linked to their jihad. They have nothing to do. Even on Article 370, they issued a statement contradicting Pakistani foreign ministers. Are these sufficient for us? Well, we should take it with a pinch of salt, I would think. We should thank Taliban for these statements and hold them to it. But the fact is that we should also not over-exaggerate the problems that we will have if Taliban elements were to be part of Afghan government. I think in the last 20 years, we have built equities across the political landscape. And I said, and even Taliban recognizes the positive role India has played in the reconstruction for the last 20 years in Afghanistan. Even while Taliban was there, in fact, and we had not recognized that regime, we did allow humanitarian flights to come to India, especially when they needed medical treatment. Our own experience is that many of the Taliban leaders and commanders who were really tired of war want their children to come to India on scholarships to study. They don't want to condemn to the lives that they had to lead, forcible madrasa education and then back to battlefield. They don't want that. Of course, for that, they will find, I think, more expendable, poorer Afghans and children growing in Pakistani refugees camps, but they don't want their children to have that life. So we don't think it'll be an absolute disaster. And please remember one thing. I think we have to hold Pakistan responsible. I don't think Taliban or anybody from, you said, no matter where the terrorist comes to Jammu and Kashmir or to India, we don't look for their nationality. We hold Pakistan responsible for its own territory and to making sure that they are not using their territory for attacks in India. And if Pakistan government is held responsible, I don't think we should worry too much about who is in power in Pakistan. We will have friends. Even if Taliban is in power sharing arrangement, we will have very, very strong friends. At least 50% of the government will be friends of India. And the other 50%, believe me, will be able to make friends much faster than Pakistan would realize what is happening. So I don't think that is a major problem. But the problem is that it will remain if Taliban is not in control or the central government in Kabul is not in control of its territory. It provides other actors certain space and also deniability. Of course, first thing is that all the training camps of various terror groups would move there, as we had seen in '79, and that is something that we would not want to happen. And that is why we need a strong government in Kabul, whoever be the actors or the holders of power there.
Thank you, Ambassador Sinha. Thank you very much for the wonderful insights on the emerging situation. Just before I take up other questions, so would you agree that Americans have failed in war and diplomacy both when it comes to Afghanistan?
No, I don't think so. In fact, I like what the American general, I forget his name, he said that the Americans don't lose a war, they just lose interest. And I think that is what has happened. There's absolutely no doubt. Forget Americans, even well-equipped Afghan security forces, I can tell you, have enough capabilities to defeat the Taliban forces. But the Taliban, enmeshed by Pakistani and other troops, with having a complete support and access to weapons and things, then it's a different ball game. And that is what we are seeing even today when the American troops are there, that they're Pakistani soldiers fighting side by side Taliban in Ghazni, in Helmand, in all sorts of places. So that, of course, that becomes a bigger challenge. So what Afghan needs are resources to fight. I don't think in terms of militarily, they can be overrun overnight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Rubin, hello. Can you hear me, Dr. Michael? Hello. Hello. Can you hear me, Dr. Michael? Hello. Can you hear me, Dr. Michael?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, yeah. Okay. So we have a few questions. I'll just read them out. No? Okay. Just a moment. Just a moment. First, what about fighters like Arabs, Uzbek, Pakistan after the NATO pulls over? I don't know what.
Well,
it's from Salma. Okay.
Just very quickly to respond to that, more skillful U.S. diplomacy would demand that they go home. Unfortunately, that demand hasn't been forthcoming. And so I would expect the Taliban to maintain themselves with those forces, those foreign fighters.
Thank you. There's one more question. I mean, what happens to the entire peace process if we have a Joe Biden administration in America? Is it going to make any difference, or how it's going to pan out?
Well, just a couple notes. If Joe Biden wins, he has more foreign policy advisors than he has positions to fill. And you also have a number of senior leaders, senior Democrats, who would look at a position in the Joe Biden administration as their last hurrah. I'm not talking about formal positions, but people like Secretary of State John Kerry might want to take a special envoy position. And so I suspect that you're going to see a repeat of what we saw during the Clinton administration, where we have literally dozens of special envoys who are tripping over the more established formal State Department bureaucracy. I would suspect that one of those senior envoys would replace Zalmay Khalilzad in pursuit of this diplomacy. Now, the difference between a Biden administration negotiated approach towards Afghanistan and the Taliban and a Trump administration is that the Biden administration is simultaneously going to try to revive talks with the Taliban. Now, superficially, some Democrats will say, let's just rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 nuclear deal. That's easier said than done because of the sunset clauses that were inherent in the Iran nuclear deal. So Iran isn't going to go back to the status quo ante when they figure, a lot of the restrictions would have already expired. So the question then becomes, when it comes to renegotiation with Iran, what sort of sweeteners can the Americans provide? And this is where a Biden administration and the Indian government might find common ground, especially if it leads to a greater open American embrace of Chabahar and the Chabahar route through into Afghanistan, which would also lessen the stranglehold which Pakistan at present has over logistics.
Thank you. Now, I have a question, okay? So this is a very, I would say, we could call it a broad question or something like that. I'm really curious about the policy making in the American strategic community. Like it has great places, Fletcher School of Diplomacy, Harvard Kennedy School, Cornell, very amazing places studying international relations and I would say diplomacy in great details. But after, for 18 long years, what should I say? That either America did not know that Pakistan is the real culprit or they didn't want to do anything. 18 years of long investment in Afghanistan, taxpayers' money. And finally, we are again back to negotiating with Taliban. These regime changes could have taken place in Pakistan also. Pak army, which is actually hands in glove with terrorists all over in Kashmir, in Afghanistan, they are the real culprits. And I guess I'm pretty sure that your establishment knew. So why such miscalculations first? And secondly, if the history shows such miscalculations in understanding, be it Iran or be it Iraq or Afghanistan, what do we conclude about the future leadership of America when it comes to dealing with China?
Okay, very good questions there. On a practical level, and I respond as an analyst again, rather than as an advocate. Pakistan has its own internal lobby in the State Department, much like Turkey does. And traditionally, I'll place some blame on Indian diplomacy for this. Because while the situation has changed over the last 15 years in the style of American and Indian diplomacy, it used to be the case that you'd go and interact with the Pakistani embassy if you wanted a nice dinner and a whiskey, and you'd interact with the Indian embassy if you wanted an argument. The Pakistanis had a very different style inside the United States. Again, that started to shift, and I'm not trying to put blame on the current Indian country team at the embassy in Washington. That's certainly not the case. This shift has been gradual and importantly bipartisan from the Bush administration with Deputy National Security Advisor Bob Blackwell through the Obama administration, through the Trump administration. There's a much broader understanding of the commonalities and the strategic partnership of India and the United States. That's not going away. But then you do have the Robin Raphaels and others, perhaps David Hales, who have been shaped in Pakistan and for whatever reason seemed inclined to embrace the Pakistani narrative despite the corrosiveness which that narrative has on American strategic interests. Certainly after Osama bin Laden was found in Abbottabad, that should have ended immediately. With regard to China, there's been a debate in American papers. The New York Times and the Washington Post are famously liberal and have labeled Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to be the worst Secretary of State ever. I mean, I certainly disagree with that. I would say Kellogg was the worst Secretary of State ever if we go back to the 1920s. But the one legacy that Mike Pompeo has, however you want to score him, is he has fundamentally changed the conversation in Washington with regard to China. We're no longer quite as delusional about China as before. And I would agree that the trajectory of the US-Pakistan relationship is increasingly going to be shaped by the fact that it's hard to accept Pakistan as anything more than a Chinese vassal right now. And the longer this continues, the more there's going to be a fundamental break or fracturing of the internal Pakistan lobby within the State Department and within Congress.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rubin. We have another question for Mr. Sumit Tripathi. This is why India doesn't have an offensive posture in countering the Taliban-Pakistan nexus. Why we have adopted a wait-and-watch policy? Doesn't India know that a Pakistan influence in Afghanistan through Taliban is against our interests? So much spent in Afghanistan, but not sure if India would be able to protect that infrastructure. Professor Nalapat, Ambassador Sinha, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, I'll be very happy to answer that question.
Yeah.
There are 4 questions in one.
Yes.
Let me start by the easiest one. Doesn't India know that a Pakistan influence in Afghanistan through Taliban is against our interest? Yes, of course we know. But that is, I think, an obvious answer. And why is it that we are not taking an offensive posture? I presume he means a military offensive posture. Because if you actually heard Pakistanis say, they think that India already has a very offensive posture. They in fact define it in military terms that there's a pincer movement of India and Afghanistan against them, which is of sort of existential threat to them. And that is, they have used that argument to justify its own policies to the West and to everybody who cares to listen to that sort of an explanation. In terms of other policies, well, I think the biggest barrier to Taliban coming back is a Republican Afghanistan government and a nationalist government. And if you look at your policies, that India has really stood behind them for the last 20 years, done everything to strengthen the Afghan state. And I think that is countering and negating what Taliban is doing. In terms of Pakistani influence in Afghanistan, let me tell you that if Pakistan were not doing what it is doing, it would have a very high level of influence in Afghanistan. In fact, in raising our own profile and influence in Afghanistan, our biggest ally and friend has been Pakistan, because they have backed the wrong Afghans, they have backed the Taliban, who have been destroying that country. So in fact, we should thank Pakistanis for giving you that great opportunity. And we have taken it with both hands, and I think we have worked on it. And that is why that the narrative, if you ever go to Afghanistan, is really between somebody who's the creator and who's the destroyer. These are the terms in which they describe India and Pakistan and their roles. Even in the military domain, of course, there's a lot that is happening. We have to realize that this is not a war where we are a combatant country. No, it is actually US-led NATO forces, and I don't think we have a role there directly in Afghanistan. But the subsidiary role or the filling of the gaps that we see in Afghan security forces, that I think India has been helping throughout, right from trading, equipment, facility, all sorts of intelligence sharing, capacity building. That is where we have focused, because the primary responsibility of the battle is with ISAF. Now, once that goes, and another point is that even with a strategic partnership with Afghanistan, when you have a situation of a hybrid, it is not even a declared war that Pakistan is having, because if it was a declared war, Afghans perhaps may have invoked their strategic partnership with India and asked you to step in militarily. Today, they cannot, because this is not a sort of a traditional warfare. You're they're facing a non-traditional threat, which is not, well, it is supported by state, but state is not at least openly involved. So these are the reasons. But of course, in any situation, you could always do more. Perhaps there will be a moment in time further down the road that you might be required to do slightly more. So we will see. We'll see. And I don't think wait and watch policy has only been, that is also a question of the last 18 months or 20 months when the US were negotiating. Then neither India nor any of other countries had any role. If you noticed, NATO partners of US were not involved in those negotiations. The US government was not involved. So I don't know what role India could have played. It was plain and simple negotiations facilitated by Qataris between the US negotiating team and the Taliban. Some countries, of course, acted, but those I always say that they were sideshows. Oh, there were gatherings in Moscow, there were gatherings in China, everybody trying to host events. But I think those were all sideshows which really did not affect what was really happening. The main show was between the US and Taliban. And I think we were well informed, we were clued in, but we didn't have to be jumping around like headless chickens, really. Today, I think it is time that India should play a very active role, and I am very happy to say that it has started doing that very recently. Last 1 month has been supremely active, and I think there will be, you will see in the next 2 months, many more Afghan leaders would be coming here. So I think government of India is on top of that brief.
Yeah. No, I just like to say, Abhinav, that so far as Afghanistan is concerned, the reality is that there is a competition between the Taliban and the Afghan military. There is a competition to recruit people, including, for example, to subvert elements of the Afghan military, elements of the Afghan establishment. And if you remember the first situation in which the Taliban kind of swept through Afghanistan, 95, 96, etc., a lot of that was facilitated by money. Just as, for example, the freedom fighters who, quote unquote, who swept through some parts of Iraq, a lot of that sweeping through happened because many of the commanders of the Iraqi forces facing them became very wealthy and relocated to different countries. So the fact of the matter is that it sends a very wrong signal to all those Afghans who are against this kind of fundamentalism and who do not want to go back to a Talibanized Afghanistan. It lowers the morale of people in the military. Now, you can have sophisticated minds who understand the nuances of policy and who understand the twists and turns and basically the camouflage or whatever. But unfortunately, a lot of individuals will believe that the Taliban is more powerful than it is because of, for example, the Khalilzad meetings, and especially if it gets into the government in Kabul in any form, it will be a signal that it is there and that will help them in mobilizing themselves. And I would like to just simply make the final point. The Taliban is not interested in any kind of a coalition. It is interested in dominating Afghanistan and dominating the government completely. And it is going to make every use of the facilities given to it to do so. That's why, I'm sorry, I believe that it is a risk. Secondly, regarding China, for example, inviting, or Russia inviting, look, these are all, when you look at the psychological situation, a lot of battles are decided by psychology. I mean, a lot of battles are decided by motivation and morale. And you have these, big powers, and you have these big powers taking you very seriously. You're encouraged to go back and tell the US, look, we're not going to do anything of what you want. We want to get our own way, and we are big people. We are welcome in Moscow. We are welcome in Beijing. Who are you? You're not the only game in town. So I'd only like to say, yes, I agree that, if you look at it in a formalistic sense, it may not amount to very much. But if you look at it in a dynamic sense, if I may say so, a chemical sense, not a mechanistic sense, it is significant that China reached out to the Taliban. And I'd only like to say that the more confusion and terror and extremism there is in different locations to the west of China, I think the less attention they calculate will be paid to what the Chinese are doing on global supply chains, on finance chains, and various other things, including development of artificial intelligence and their military.
Thank you very much, Professor Narapat and Ambassador Sinha. I mean, what I get from this whole conversation is that we are, ahead for a more darker and a disastrous Afghanistan, okay, with more disturbance and turbulence. Okay, with this, just one final or two final questions. What happens to the Afghan army? Like 3 lakh strength of Afghan security forces and the police. Okay? I mean, do they join Taliban? Are they going to disarm? Still, they are fighting with the Taliban security. I mean, Taliban is attacking the Afghan security forces. What's going to happen to them? Any of you, if you would like to take the question?
No, I think the question should be what will happen to the Taliban fighters who demobilize, not Afghan forces. Right? I think that's what you mean. I don't know. That's what I said, that this narrative that as if the Afghan government has to go and reconcile and reintegrate with Taliban is a wrong way of looking at it. But let me answer what Prakhar has asked here. An assertive policy, independent and assertive policy. See, our policy on Afghanistan in terms of US presence has been that it has been a stabilizing factor. Of course, but it is their decision to stay or to go. But the only thing that we have expected was that it will be organized and a systematic withdrawal, not a rushed exit, which will send a different signal. And I think that the fact that we did not get in line and started giving legitimacy, because you see, when the US was negotiating with Taliban, it was giving it a certain legitimacy. Perhaps it wanted other countries to do so, and that is what the Russians did. They organized a forum where they met with Afghan leaders. They called the regional countries. The Chinese also wanted. The Chinese organized Mr. Narapat, but unfortunately that failed. They wanted to have. Of course, they have had contacts with Taliban, but their attempt to do a Me Too like Russia in China did not happen, because they did not have they lost nerves at the last minute. You see, the Russians went ahead even when Ghani government said that they won't participate. When the Chinese tried to do that, I think they lost nerves in the end, and that did not happen. And that, I think, was a loss of face for the Chinese, because soon after that, I don't know whether it's connected, their special representative for Afghanistan was changed. He was sent away as ambassador to ASEAN. Who had served in China. So I don't know, but of course these things don't come public. But I surmise that the leadership in China would not have taken it kindly that he sold them a pup, that he would get all the Afghans and Taliban to come and confabulate. And of course it builds their prestige. You see, from Russian perspective, look at it from the foreign policy perspective, that from being a sort of a taboo in Afghanistan, not being on the scene at all, completely cut out of all sort of negotiations. Even when the Americans started in 2015, the Quad, they had invited China, surprisingly, but not Russia. So they got, after their Syria experience, they wanted to get on the center table, and they did. And I think it was a great diplomatic win for them. But they also developed certain understanding with the Americans, because 29th February, what a lot of people miss out, that there were not one document, which is of course the agreement. There were 3 documents. One was signed as a joint press release between the US government and the Russian government. You have to see that. And that is why it was kept a secret. It only got released after 7-8 days, when all the brouhaha over the agreement ended, because both US and Russia there have jointly agreed that the re-establishment of Islamic Emirate is not acceptable. Now, if that had become public on 28th, Taliban wouldn't have even signed the agreement on 29th. Then you look at what the US government has issued, a joint press release or a joint statement with the Afghan government on 29th. And there are contradictions, and that's what is leading to this stalemate that we see in the talks. They actually contradict, because it looks like as if US government has promised different things to Taliban and different things to Afghanistan. So I think, suppose, to answer Prakhar's question in short, suppose the US government tomorrow decides the Taliban should come back as the main power in government. I think government of India will take a decision and will take a stand which may contradict that position. But I don't think that is a likelihood, because ultimately, India's partnership with the US cannot be only sea focused or in the Indo-Pacific. It has to also focus on the security concerns on the land. And I think the American interlocutors are very sort of conscious of that they will not do something. They're not going to leave it to Pakistan to manage Afghanistan for them. I don't think that's going to happen. On the other questions on the women, etc., yes, that's a major issue. Taliban till today have not yet clarified their stand on how they're going to deal with the issue of women, their rights, their education. All they say that Quran gives them all the rights and we will sort of deal with it within the light of Quran. Nothing beyond that they have said. However, some of the Taliban leaders, when they have interacted in webinars, etc., they still seem to hold on to the old idea that women will have restricted rights in terms of movement and the choices. In fact, we had a very interesting conversation with some Taliban leaders the other day, where they were asked that how will you enforce Mehram? That Mehram is a system where any woman who steps out goes with somebody, a male accompaniment in the family. I said, you guys have killed so many Afghan men that there are many women who are really in households where there are no men left. So actually that Taliban leader had the cheek, we'll make arrangements, we'll issue them separate passes. So while that is the mindset, they are not coming out, and this is of course not their official position, but one of the important leader who has been their Minister for Justice, etc., has to say. So this gives you a peep into their thinking. That they haven't evolved in terms of whatever they say, whatever Quran gives, and of course so when you ask them that what is it that they want in Afghanistan to change so that Afghanistan becomes even more Islamic, they again don't have specific answers. They just talk about good governance, no corruption, there should be absolutely no drugs, etc., etc. But they don't reveal very much in terms of what form of government they have. Perhaps they don't reveal because they themselves don't know. They don't have an experience of running any sensible government. Even 96 government was, well, they had ministers, etc., but I don't think it was a government in the sense that we understand it. So yes, that's a concern, and I don't think Afghan women are going to give it up that easily, nor are the Afghan men. Yes, and the prisoners, unfortunate, it was an unconditional release. That was the agreement, that up to 5,000 prisoners would be released. Taliban turned it into demanding that all 5,000 get released even before they sit with the Afghan side. And that demand had to be met under great sort of pressure that was put on Afghan government. And there was even no commitment that they'll go back to the battlefield. And there are reports that many of them are gone back and are fighting, some of them since killed. And now Taliban is using that as an excuse to say, this is the reason why we'll continue fighting, because the guys you released you are killing them. So yeah, we are looking at some sort of an endless arguments that they are making. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. So with this, we come to the end of our today's session. Professor Nalapal, Dr. Rubin, would you like to say something in the final remarks? Okay,
No, I think I'll defer to Michael Rubin, and apart from repeating what I've said, that one cannot finesse beyond a point. One has to make choices, and I mean, I've also come in contact with individuals, from Afghanistan, of course, in a slightly less formal setting than Ambassador Sinha. And I would like to say that they have been very clear about their objectives. They have been very clear about the kind of government and the kind of system they want. They have been very clear about what they see, the Americans, Western people, society in general, and their so-called partners in the government. And they're also very clear as to what is going to be done with anybody in the Afghan National Army who doesn't fall in line. So the people I have spoken to, maybe the different kind of people, they were very clear. Just as, for example, when I have gone to China, I mean, they spoke in terms of a dollar reset. They spoke in terms of, of digitalization, of blockchain, of other methods. and basically conveying the clear impression that basically when the dollar gets reset, what is the obvious currency that, along with, of course, other currencies, which will be in that basket, a prominent, the lead currency will be the RMB. So, in a sense, I think, being an academic and being independent and having absolutely no linkages with any government, I think that, the Afghans, the people I have spoken to who acknowledge that they are Taliban, and yes, Ambassador Sinha is quite right. Quite a lot of Taliban families have been sent here, just as a lot of families that are active in Kashmir, whose relatives are active in Kashmir, are also living and studying here in India. But I'd only like to say that they have been very clear, and which is why, I'm saying a simple point. Let me just end with this. When you look at the Iraq war, when you look at, for example, ISIS, and as I said, ISIS bribed their way to victory and to get control of large parts of Iraq, and that bribe came from certain states. And I'm sure the Treasury Department of the United States has fairly accurate data as to who paid those bribes and to whom. I'd only like to say that we need to be very, very clear as to what we are dealing with in Afghanistan. And I think we have to be very, very clear about the fact that we need to maintain the morale of the Afghan National Army. We need to maintain the morale of the Afghan government in a situation where their relatives, their friends, and their international partners are telling them, look, in effect, you're going to be irrelevant. They've seen the example of Najibullah. You have John Bolton who said to Kim Jong-un, well, you're going to follow we're going to follow the Libya model. Look, people know what happened to Najibullah. People know what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. So I can only say that the people whom I have been speaking to have been quite forthcoming. Mainly because I think I'm speaking to somebody completely outside official listing who's an independent person, and possibly because of that. But to say that the Taliban don't have a game plan, they have a game plan and they are working to it. And in my view, that game plan has got to be defeated.
Thank you, Professor Nalla. But Dr. Rubin?
I'll be brief in conclusion. To narrowly answer the last question about the Afghan National Army, look, the United States has a habit of thinking we're winning hearts and minds, but in reality, we are only renting them. And that's a delusion that the Americans constantly trip over. Now, the problem with the Afghan National Army is they can fight, and they can fight very well. The problem they're going to face is logistics. How do they get from one place to another in order to maintain that fight? Now, if we want to look at the problem holistically, the Taliban can't win 5% in free and fair elections. And yet they want, through violence, to convince us to allow them to achieve what they can't do on their own. The delusion in Washington, and Zalmay Khalilzad's delusion, is that the Taliban can somehow bring stability. Back before 2001, they had consolidated control over 90% of the country. They're not going to be able to do that again. Now, I do think in the question about women, it's worth remembering the way former Pakistani ambassador to the United States, Hussein Haqqani, described the Taliban. You've got to think of them almost like the Khmer Rouge. They don't have a necessarily uniform policy across the country, but when it comes to women, they are fundamentally anti-urban, anti-cosmopolitan, and so the way they treat women in Kabul is very different than the way they would treat women in Paktika. And this was certainly my experience when I was in Afghanistan back in 2000 under the Islamic Emirate and so forth. When it comes to releasing the prisoners, of course, there's no recidivism program, simply because the Afghan government didn't have a seat at the table. We completely kneecapped them in this, and the Taliban to this day don't recognize the Afghan government. So if we, just in conclusion, the Pakistanis often accuse us of treating them like a fair weather friend. From the very beginning, we wanted to ally with India. India rejected our alliance, And so we ended up with Pakistan as the second choice. It's like asking the pretty girl to the prom. We get rejected and we go with the ugly girl instead. That's essentially what U.S. policy was throughout the Cold War. Now, Pakistan has accused us, the Symington Amendment, some of the issues with regard to the nukes, we've always sanctioned them when we don't need them. Well, Pakistan is creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, where I hope that will continue. We should sanction them for their actions. What's always interesting is when we look at the state sponsor of terrorism list, which is becoming very short as Sudan has been removed. After 2001, after 9/11, by executive order, the Bush administration allowed the Treasury Department to also designate terrorism. And the Treasury Department did so without any of the diplomatic considerations. If you compare the Treasury Department list with the State Department list, it's about 30 times as long right now, and Pakistan has quite a place of honor on that list with all the groups it sponsors. I would seriously suggest that we're getting to the point, both with Turkey and with Pakistan, that we can no longer allow the subjective to trump the objective, and that Pakistan ultimately is going to be looking at a state sponsor of terrorism list designation in the State Department as well, as we continue down this path.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So with this, I would like to end today's session, and I would like to thank all our eminent speakers, Ambassador Amar Sinha, Dr. Michael Rubin, and Professor Nalapat for sharing your thoughts and your experiences on this matter. And I would also like to thank my colleagues Shahana and Karthik for supporting me in this webinar, and our participants and all the audiences. Okay, thank you for spending your time and supporting us. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.